They called it the Great Die-Up, the winter when the snow fell so hard and stayed so long that the cattle froze standing upright, statues of ice scattered across the plains. But in the high country of the Montana Territory, in the shadow of the Continental Divide, it wasn't just livestock that froze. It was hearts. It was hopes. In the year 1885, the frontier was a place where silence was a currency. Men like Silas Blackwood, a timber baron with a soul allegedly forged from the same cold iron he worked in his shop, hoarded silence like gold. He was a man who had buried a wife and buried his softness beneath layers of wool and wealth. A man the townspeople whispered about but never spoke to. And then there was Elara Vance. They called her the shadow of her family, a woman of 26. An age that, in the cruel arithmetic of the frontier, marked her as expired goods. A spinster, a burden. A woman who moved through rooms without displacing the air, mending the lace for her sisters, wedding gowns while her own life withered like a frost-bitten poppy in a jar. But the frontier has a strange way of upending destinies. It takes the broken, the discarded, and the invisible, and it offers them a choice: wither and die, or find a way to bloom through the ice. What happens when the man everyone fears sees the woman everyone ignores? What happens when a moment of utter social humiliation becomes the spark for a love so quiet yet so fierce? It defies the rigid caste system of a boomtown. This isn't just a story about finding a husband. It is a forensic examination of dignity. It is a tale of frozen hearts, secret letters written in the language of flowers, and the resilience of the bitter root, the flower that looks dead and dry, only to resurrect itself when the rains come. Welcome to Frontier Rescue Stories. I'm your host, Jasper Ashwood. Today, we open the heavy oak doors of history to witness a rescue of the soul in the Montana high country. If you believe that true worth isn't defined by society's whispers, and if you love tales of redemption under the big sky, make sure to subscribe. Now pull your chair closer to the fire. The wind is rising, and the story is about to begin. The year was 1885. The Montana Territory was teetering on the edge of statehood, a land caught between the raw violence of its recent past and the desperate, often performative civility of its future. While the Copper Kings of Butte were tearing, the earth opened to wire the world for electricity in the smaller, aspirational settlements like Pine Ridge. The war was fought not with pickaxes, but with tea services and calling cards. In the Vance household, the parlor was the battlefield. The room was stiflingly hot, heated by a cast-iron stove that roared in the corner, and thick with the scent of potpourri, dried rose petals and lavender, a smell that Elara Vance would forever associate with the sensation of suffocation. It was Tuesday, the day Mrs. Vance insisted on receiving callers, a ritual imported from the East Coast and enforced with military precision. The furniture was heavy, dark walnut upholstered in horsehair that scratched the skin, and every surface was covered in doilies, as if the house itself were trying to hide its rough-hewn origins under layers of lace. Elara stood by the window, half hidden by the velvet drapes. She was 26 years old. In a city like Boston or New York, she might have been considered merely independent or perhaps sensible. But here, in a territory where men outnumbered women 3-to-1, her single status was viewed as a pathology, a defect. She wore a dress of gray calico, the fabric of utility, devoid of the bustles, trains, and intricate beadwork that adorned her sisters. It was a Mother Hubbard style, practical and loose, designed for work, not for allure. Her sisters, Clara and Beatrice, were the antithesis of Elara's gray existence. Clara, the eldest, was draped in a gown of crimson silk, the fabric rustling with every breath she took. Beatrice, younger and sharper, wore a dress of royal blue with a tight, cuirass bodice that accentuated her figure, a fashion plate straight out of Godey's Lady's Book. They sat on the settee like exotic birds, their fans fluttering and their laughter high and brittle. "Look at this!" Clara squealed, holding up a cream-colored envelope with theatrical astonishment. The wax seal had been broken, the red shards scattered on the mahogany table like drops of blood. Another invitation, the harvest ball at the Union Hall, and Mr. Thornton, the banker's son, you know, has specifically asked for the pleasure of my first dance. Beatrice giggled behind her fan, her eyes darting maliciously toward the window where Elara stood. "Oh, Clara, you must be careful. You'll break so many hearts you'll need a basket to carry the pieces. Unlike some of us, who can barely manage to attract a stray dog." The room went silent. The guests, members of the local sewing circle, women who prided themselves on their Christian charity, exchanged glances. Some were pitying, others barely concealed their amusement. In the Victorian era, the spinster was a figure of ridicule, a woman who had failed in her primary biological and social duty. The term itself, originally denoting a woman who spun wool for a living, had curdled into an insult implying fussiness, undesirability, and a life of eccentric isolation. Elara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a burning flush that started at her collarbone and consumed her face. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She had learned over years of such moments that any reaction only fed the fire. She fixed her gaze on a small imperfection in the braided rug, a loose thread of blue wool, and wished with a desperate, silent intensity that she could unravel along with it. Her mother, Mrs. Vance, sat in her high-backed rocking chair by the hearth. She was the architect of this environment. She wore a heavy dress of black bombazine, the uniform of the respectable matron, and a cameo brooch at her throat. She held a string of wooden rosary beads, her thumb rubbing the smooth surfaces in a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. She heard the insult. She saw the color flood her middle daughter's face, and she did nothing. To Mrs. Vance, Elara's lack of prospects was not a tragedy. It was an embarrassment. It was a public declaration that the Vance stock was flawed. Defending Elara would only draw attention to the failure. "Elara," Mrs. Vance said finally, her voice flat and devoid of warmth. "The tea is getting cold. Do refresh the pot, and perhaps check the scones. They were a bit dry last time. We cannot have the Thornton boy thinking we serve stale bread." It was a dismissal, plain and simple. Elara dipped her head, a reflex of obedience honed over years of practice. "Yes, mother," she whispered. The sound was barely audible, a ghost of a voice. She took the heavy porcelain teapot, its floral pattern a mockery of the blooming life she was denied, and retreated to the kitchen. But she didn't stop there. The kitchen, with its demanding heat and the prying eyes of the hired cook, was no sanctuary. She continued out the back door into the cool, biting air of the late autumn afternoon. The landscape of the Montana high country stretched out before her, vast, indifferent, and breathtakingly beautiful. The air smelled of sagebrush and impending snow. Her feet carried her instinctively to the garden shed, a weathered structure of rough-hewn pine that smelled of damp earth, dried herbs, and solitude. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through cracks in the wood. Bundles of drying sage, tansy, and pennyroyal hung from the rafters. In the Victorian language of flowers, or florography, these plants carried heavy meanings. Tansy meant, "I declare war against you." Pennyroyal advised flee. They were the herbs of resistance and escape. Elara set the teapot down on a potting bench and finally let her composure shatter. She sank to her knees beside a crate of winter squash, burying her face in her hands. The tears came not as a storm, but as a slow, leaking despair. It wasn't just the mockery. It was the loneliness. It was the crushing certainty that her life would be nothing more than this. A series of empty rooms, cold teas, and the echo of other people's joy. She was a spectator in her own existence. A wallflower in the truest, most painful sense, decorative background foliage, unnoticed and unpicked. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shingles of the shed. It was a Chinook wind, warm and erratic, a precursor to the changing seasons. To the indigenous peoples, the Blackfeet and the Salish, it was the snow eater, a force of transformation capable of raising temperatures by 40 degrees in an hour. To Elara, it was just another sound to drown out her sobbing, while Elara wept among the dried herbs. The parlor remained a hub of calculated social strategy. Clara and Beatrice were already planning their ensembles for the upcoming barn raising. At the Pine Ridge settlement, it was to be a grand affair, a gathering of the entire county and, more importantly, a hunting ground for eligible bachelors. "They say Silas Blackwood will be there," Beatrice whispered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. The room went silent. The name carried weight. Silas Blackwood was a legend in the high country, a timber baron and rancher whose wealth was rumored to be as vast as the mountains themselves. He was one of the new breed of Western aristocrats, men who had wrested fortunes from the forests and the mines, often using ruthless tactics that bordered on those of the robber. Barons of the East, he was a man of steel and silence, a widower who had retreated into his work after a tragedy that the townspeople discussed only in hushed tones. He was powerful, imposing, and utterly unattainable. "He never comes to socials," Clara scoffed, though she smoothed her skirt nervously. "He's a bear of a man. They say he prefers the company of his horses to people. And his house. They say it's full of clocks. Hundreds of them. But he's rich, Mrs. Vance interjected, her eyes gleaming with predatory ambition. And a man of his standing needs a wife. A proper wife. One who can manage a household and present a dignified face to the territory. A man like that does not marry for love. He marries for management. She looked at her two eldest daughters, assessing them like prize livestock at a county fair. We will attend. And you will both be perfect. Elara was not mentioned. In the strategic map of Mrs. Vance's ambitions, Elara was not a piece on the board. She was part of the table, necessary, functional, and unnoticed. Back in the shed, Elara dried her eyes on her apron. The rough fabric scratched her skin, a grounding sensation. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her skirt. She picked up the teapot, now cold. She would have to brew a fresh pot. She would have to go back in there. She would have to endure. But as she stepped out of the shed, a strange resolve settled in her chest. It was faint like the first star in a twilight sky, but it was there. The tears had washed away some of the fear, leaving behind a hardened core of dignity. She looked at the horizon, where the jagged peaks of the Rockies sliced into the purple sky. "I am not nothing," she whispered to the wind. She didn't know it then, but the wind she spoke to was carrying the seeds of a new life. The invisible woman was about to be seen, and the high country, with all its perils and promises, was waiting. The barn raising at Pine Ridge was the social apex of the season. In the 1880s, a barn raising was more than a construction project. It was a communal sacrament. It was where the scattered population of the frontier, the homesteaders, the miners, the merchants, and the barons converged to assert their civilization against the wilderness. The structure itself was a cathedral of fresh pine, its skeletal ribs rising against the backdrop of a snow-dusted mountain range. Lanterns hung from the beams, casting a golden, flickering light that danced over the sawdust-covered floor. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, likely venison or elk, spiced with sage, cider, and the resinous tang of cut wood. Fiddlers stood on a makeshift stage of hay bales, sawing out tunes like Turkey in the Straw and the Arkansas Traveler. The music was infectious, driving the dancers into the swirling patterns of the quadrille and the Virginia reel, men in their Sunday best, wool-sack coats and starched collars, with their spurs carefully removed, as per the strict etiquette of the Western dance. Floor bowed to women in calico and silk. The Vance sisters arrived like peacocks entering a chicken coop. Clara was resplendent in emerald green, a color that demanded attention, while Beatrice wore a gown of shimmering copper that caught the lantern light. They moved with practiced grace, their eyes scanning the room for targets, their fans fluttering like the wings of anxious moths. Mrs. Vance shepherded them, a general maneuvering her troops. Elara followed a few paces behind. She wore a dress of pale blue gingham, simple, high-collared and meticulously neat. It was a dress she had made herself, stitching late into the night by the light of a tallow candle. It had no lace, no ribbons, no bustle to exaggerate her form. It was the dress of a woman who expects to serve punch, not to be asked to dance. Her hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, held in place by a plain tortoise-shell comb. She wore no jewelry, save for a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, tucked discreetly beneath her collar. While her sisters launched themselves into the fray, giggling and curtsying to the sons of bankers and cattlemen, Elara drifted to the periphery. She found a quiet corner near a display of quilts, the handiwork of the local women's guild. Quilts in the 19th century West were not merely bedding. They were texts. They were the diaries of women who often had no time to write. Elara found herself captivated by a particular quilt, a log cabin pattern. This design was iconic on the frontier. It consisted of strips of fabric emanating from a central square. The light strips represented the sunny side of the house, the dark strips the shadows. But the center, the heart, was traditionally red, symbolizing the hearth, the fire that kept the family alive through the winter. This specific quilt, however, was done in somber earth tones, deep browns, forest greens, and slate grays. But the central hearth squares were stitched in a brilliant, defiant crimson. It was a subtle scream of color in a landscape of restraint. Elara reached out, her fingers hovering over the intricate stitching. She traced the lines of the fabric, lost in the story the needle had told. It spoke of endurance, of keeping a fire burning when the world outside was frozen. "It is a barn-raising variation," a voice rumbled from behind her. though the Maker had a heavy hand with the shadows. Elara started, turning quickly. She found herself looking up and up into the face of a man who seemed to have been hewn from the mountain itself. Silas Blackwood stood well over 6 feet tall. He wore a coat of dark, heavy wool that absorbed the light, and a charcoal vest over a stark white shirt. He carried no weapons, yet he radiated a sense of dangerous capability. His face was weathered, etched with lines mapped by wind and sun, and a thick, dark beard framed a jawline that suggested unyielding stubbornness. But it was his eyes that held her, steel gray, intelligent, and currently fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I beg your pardon, sir," Elara stammered, pulling her hand back as if she had been caught stealing. "I was just admiring the work." "Do not apologize for seeing what others miss," Silas said. His voice was deep, a baritone that vibrated in her chest. "Most people walk past these to get to the punch bowl. You have been standing here for 10 minutes, studying the stitching." Elara blinked. He had been watching her? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. It's not just the stitching," she said, surprising herself with her honesty. "It's the center, the red. It looks like a heart beating under the floorboards." Silas's eyebrows lifted slightly. A flicker of surprise crossed his stoic features. "A heart under the floorboards," he repeated slowly, tasting the words. "That is a poetic way to describe a piece of bedding, miss?" "Vance," she said softly. "Elara Vance. Silas Blackwood." He didn't bow, but he inclined his head, with a solemn respect that felt more genuine than any florid gesture she had ever seen in her mother's parlor. Across the barn, the atmosphere shifted. Clara had spotted them. She nudged Beatrice, pointing with her fan. "Look," she hissed. Is that the mountain man? With Elara?" "It can't be," Beatrice whispered, squinting. "Why would he talk to her? She's wearing gingham. She looks like a school teacher who lost her classroom. He must be asking for directions," Clara decided, her voice dripping with dismissal. Or perhaps he mistook her for a servant. But Silas was not asking for directions. "Do you sew, Miss Vance?" he asked. "I do," Elara replied, her confidence growing in the shelter of his large presence. "Though my work is practical. Mending mostly. Hemming. My sisters require significant maintenance." "Practicality is an underrated virtue," Silas said. "In the high country, beauty without utility is a burden. A flower that cannot survive the frost is just a memory waiting to fade." Elara looked up at him, really looked at him. She saw the fatigue in his eyes, a weariness that went beyond physical tiredness. She saw a man who carried a weight he couldn't set down. "Some flowers bloom under the snow, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly. "The crocus, the bitterroot, they survive because they keep their beauty hidden until the sun is strong enough to hold them. They are revived." She used the botanical term for the bitterroot, the state flower, known for its ability to regenerate from dry roots. Silas went still. The noise of the party, the fiddles, the laughter, the stomping boots seemed to fade away, leaving them in a bubble of silence. He looked at her as if she were a rare specimen he had discovered on a high ridge. "Would you—" he started, then cleared his throat, a rare sign of hesitation. "The air in here is stifling. Would you permit me to walk with you? Just to the edge of the lantern light?" Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. To walk with a man, unchaperoned, away from the crowd, it was scandalous. It was dangerous. It was everything she had been taught to fear. She looked across the room. Her mother was glaring at her, telegraphing a command to return to her place in the shadows. Elara turned back to Silas. "I would like that very much, sir." They walked out of the barn and into the cool night air. The moon was full, painting the landscape in silver and indigo. They walked in silence for a long moment, the crunch of their boots on the frost-hardened ground the only sound. "I am not a man of society, Miss Vance," Silas said abruptly. "I find these gatherings hollow. Everyone speaks, but no one says anything. They use words to hide, not to reveal." "I understand," Elara said. "Silence is often more honest." "My aunt," Silas continued, looking out toward the dark tree line. "Miss Cordelia Blackwood. She lives with me at the homestead. She is advancing in years. She needs a companion, someone with patience, someone who understands the value of a quiet room. Not a servant," he clarified quickly. "A companion. Someone who can read to her. Someone who can be present." He turned to face her. "She is a difficult woman, exacting, but she has a good heart. She needs someone like you." "Like me?" Elara asked, confused. Someone who sees the heart under the floorboards, Silas said. I am offering a position of respect. Miss Vance, you would have your own quarters, your own time. You would be safe. Elara stopped walking. A job? A way out? You want me to come to your ranch? I want to know the person who said those words about the quilt, Silas admitted, his voice dropping lower. I want to see if the crocus can bloom in my winter. It was a cryptic, almost romantic confession, wrapped in a pragmatic offer. Elara felt a thrill of vertigo. This was the precipice. I cannot decide tonight, she whispered. I will speak to your mother, Silas said, his tone shifting back to iron resolve. I will call on her tomorrow. Be ready. He walked her back to the barn entrance but did not go inside. As Elara returned to the suffocating heat of the party, she felt marked, changed. The invisible woman had been seen, and for the first time in her life, she was terrified of what might happen next. The arrival of Silas Blackwood's carriage. The next afternoon was less a social call and more a tactical strike. The vehicle was a high-end landaulet, black lacquered and polished to a mirror shine, drawn by two massive bays that snorted steam into the cold air. When Silas stepped down, the neighbors peered from behind twitching lace curtains, their whispers spreading like wildfire. In the Vance parlor, the atmosphere was brittle. Mrs. Vance sat rigidly, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Silas did not waste time with pleasantries. He declined tea, a significant breach of etiquette that signaled he was there for business, not pleasure. He stood in the center of the room, filling the space, and laid out his proposal to Mrs. Vance with the precision of a timber contract. His aunt needed a companion. Miss Elara had been recommended. The compensation would be generous. The arrangement would begin immediately. Mrs. Vance was torn between indignation and opportunism. On one hand, the idea of her daughter working was a slight to the family name. On the other hand, the connection to the Blackwood, fortune, and the removal of a daughter she considered a liability was intoxicating. It is highly irregular, Mrs. Vance sniffed, feigning reluctance. It is necessary, Silas countered. My aunt is in delicate health. I require someone of impeccable character. Your daughter is that person. The deal was struck. Elara was lent to the Blackwood estate. 2 days later, Elara found herself in the carriage, her small trunk strapped to the back. As the town faded behind them, replaced by the towering ponderosa pines and rocky outcrops of the high country, she felt a strange sense of shedding skin. The air here was thinner, sharper. It smelled of pine resin and snow. The Blackwood homestead, known as Iron Ridge, was a fortress of stone and timber built into the side of a mountain. It was an architectural marvel, blending the rustic, great camp style of the Adirondacks with the rugged utility of a working ranch. The house was massive, with heavy slate roofs and chimneys that puffed gray smoke into the sky. Elara was greeted not by Silas, who had ridden ahead, but by the housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, who showed her to her room. It was spacious, far larger than her room at home, with a fireplace that was already lit and a window that framed the jagged peaks of the Continental Divide. But the first thing Elara noticed was sound. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. The house was alive with sound of clocks. Grandfather clocks in the hallways, mantel clocks in the bedrooms, a cuckoo clock in kitchen. They didn't tick in unison. They created a chaotic, rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to echo the pulse of the house itself. Clocks were a status symbol in the 1880s, a sign of modernity and order. But here they felt obsessive. Miss Cordelia likes to know the time, Mrs. Higgins said dryly. She says time is the only thing we truly own, so we best keep track of it. Miss Cordelia Blackwood held court in the sunroom, a glass-walled extension filled with ferns and exotic orchids that shouldn't have survived a Montana winter. She was a tiny bird-like woman wrapped in shawls, with eyes as sharp and gray as her nephew's. So, Cordelia said, peering at Elara through a lorgnette, you're the quiet one. Silas says you listen. Can you read? Yes, ma'am, Elara replied. I love to read. Good. My eyes are failing, but my mind is not. I want Dickens. I want Tolstoy. I want to hear about people who suffer more than I do. And so Elara's new life began. It was a routine of quiet service, but unlike her life at home, it felt purposeful. She read to Cordelia for hours. She learned the rhythms of the house, the creak of the stairs, the light in the library, the brooding silence of Silas's study door. She saw Silas rarely. He was a shadow in his own home, appearing for dinner, eating quickly, and retreating to his workshop. The workshop was a separate building, a sprawling structure near the stables. Smoke poured from its chimney day and night. One afternoon, driven by curiosity, Elara wandered near the workshop. The sound of metal striking metal rang out, a rhythmic clang, clang, clang. She peeked inside. The heat hit her first, a wall of dry, intense warmth. The air smelled of coal dust, sulfur, and hot iron, the primordial scents of the earth. In the center of the room, Silas stood by a forge, stripped to his shirt sleeves, a heavy leather apron covering his chest. He was hammering a piece of glowing orange steel, his muscles bunching and releasing. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a blacksmith, a creator. He sensed her presence and stopped. He turned, his face streaked with soot. "I didn't mean to intrude," Elara said quickly. "You are not intruding," Silas said, wiping his brow. "This is where I think." The house has too many ghosts. Here, fire burns them away." "What are you making?" she asked. He picked up the piece of metal with tongs. It was twisted, delicate. "A gate," he said, "for the garden. Iron can be strong, Elara, but it can also be soft if you know how to treat it." He looked at her, and the metaphor hung heavy. "My wife," he said suddenly. "She died in that house. 5 years ago. Consumption. I couldn't save her. I had all this money, and I couldn't buy her a breath." Elara stepped into the workshop. "You blame yourself." "I blame the cold," he said bitterly. "I blame the silence." She faded away. "Only if you let the frost win," Elara said. "Iron is strong, Silas, but it needs the fire. Maybe you just need someone to tend the hearth." For the first time, Silas smiled. It was a small, crooked thing. "Maybe," he whispered. The bond between them was forming, not through grand declarations, but through the shared language of work and silence. But outside, the winter was coming, and with it, a storm that would test them both. The winter of 1886 came early and stayed late. Meteorological records from the time describe it as a blockade of ice, with blizzards that buried train tracks and froze cattle. Where they stood, Iron Ridge became an island in a white sea. For Elara, the isolation was a cocoon. Her days with Miss Cordelia had softened into friendship. "You have a backbone, girl," Cordelia told her. "My nephew needs a woman with a backbone. His first wife, she was spun sugar, sweet, but she melted in the rain. You are made of sterner stuff. Wool and grit." Silas began joining them for tea. At first he sat stiffly, holding the delicate china cup like a live grenade. But slowly he relaxed. He spoke of the ranch, of the winter herd, of the ironwork he was designing. He watched Elara as she read, his gaze tracking her with a hunger he no longer hid. One evening, a blizzard struck with the force of a physical blow. The wind howled like a banshee. The clocks chimed 7, barely audible. Silas entered the parlor, shaking snow from his coat. "The road is blocked," he announced. "No one is getting in or out for days." Elara felt a thrill of safety. The world couldn't touch them here. But the world has a way of intrusion. 3 days later, as the storm broke and the sun glared off the blinding white drifts, a sleigh fought its way up the drive. Elara watched from the window, recognizing the red velvet cloaks. It was Clara and Beatrice. They burst into the house in a flurry of feigned concern. Silas was out checking the herd, leaving Elara and Mrs. Higgins to receive them. "Elara," Clara cried. "Oh, you poor thing." "Trapped up here!" Mother was beside herself. "We came as soon as the road was passable." "I am quite fine, Clara," Elara said. "I am working." "Working?" Beatrice sneered, looking around the grand hallway. "Is that what you call it? Living in luxury with a bachelor? The town is talking, Elara. They say you've compromised yourself." "They say," she lowered her voice, "they say you're trying to replace his dead wife, that you're wearing her clothes, sleeping in her bed." The accusation was vile. "That is a lie," Elara said, her voice trembling. "Is it?" Clara asked. "Look at you. You've put on weight. Your cheeks are pink. Men like Silas Blackwood don't marry the help. They use them. We're here to save you. Pack your things." "No," Elara said. "Excuse me?" Clara blinked. "No," Elara said louder. "I am employed here. I am respected here, and I will not leave." "Jealousy?" Beatrice laughed. "Of you? The spinster? The shadow? Oh, Elara, you are pathetic." At that moment, the front door opened. Silas filled the frame, bringing the cold with him. He took in the scene instantly. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice was low, a rumble of distant thunder. "Mr. Blackwood." Clara beamed. We were so worried about our sister. We came to take her home. She is home, Silas said. The silence was absolute. Elara is under my protection, Silas said, walking to stand beside her. She is a valued member of this household, and unless she wishes to leave, she stays. He turned his cold gray eyes on the sisters. You, however, are trespassing. Mrs. Higgins will show you out. Clara and Beatrice stormed out, flinging insults about mountain savages. When the door slammed, Silas turned to Elara, the anger drained. Replaced by vulnerability. I'm sorry you had to hear that, he said. They are my family, Elara said, tears spilling. But they don't know me. I know you, Silas said. He took her hand. His palm was rough, warm. I know you read poetry until your voice is hoarse. I know you see hearts and quilts. I know you are the only spring this house has seen in 5 years. Silas, I was going to wait to do this properly, but I cannot let you think you are help. Elara, I don't want a companion for my aunt. I want a partner for me. The declaration hung in the air. But back in town, the sisters spun a tale of Elara the seductress. The whispers grew toxic. Elara felt the shift when she went into town. Shopkeepers wouldn't meet her eye. She returned to Iron Ridge shaking. If I stay here, I ruin you too, she told Silas. Let them talk, he said. But it reaches me, she cried. I cannot be the cause of your shame. That night she packed. She wrote a letter. I will not be the shadow that darkens your door. You deserve the light, and I must find my own way to shine, or stay in the dark forever. She left before dawn, taking the mail coach to Helena, leaving Silas the clocks, and the iron gate unfinished. Elara did not return to the Vance household. She used her wages to rent a room in a boarding house in Helena. It was a frightening, exhilarating leap. For the first time, she was entirely alone. She found work in a dressmaker's shop. Her skills, once dismissed as practical, were recognized here as exquisite. She incorporated motifs of the high country into her embroidery, tiny depictions of sagebrush, pine cones, and the bitter root flower. Her designs caught the eye of wealthy women. They knew her not as the Spinster Vance, but as the talented seamstress. Months passed. Spring arrived. Elara built a life. She bought books. She walked in the park. She discovered she was capable. But at night she dreamed of ticking clocks and the smell of hot iron. One rainy April afternoon, the bell above the shop door jingled. Elara was on her knees pinning a hem. I am looking for a seamstress, a voice said. One who understands that beauty must have a spine. Elara froze. She stood up slowly. Silas filled the shop. He looked thinner, his face lined. Silas, she breathed. You are hard to find, Elara, he said. Why are you here? Because the clock stopped, he said. When you left, the house went silent. I tried to go back to the ice, but I couldn't. You melted it. He pulled an object from his pocket. It was a piece of ironwork, a delicate black metal replica of a bitterroot flower. I made this, he said. It took me 3 months. I had to learn how to make the iron gentle enough. It reminded me of you, strong enough to survive the winter, beautiful enough to shame the roses. Elara took the flower. I didn't leave because I didn't care, she whispered. I left because I cared too much to let them drag you down. I don't care about them, Silas said. I care about the woman who saw a beating heart in a quilt. He dropped to one knee on the dusty floor. Elara Vance, he said. I am broken and I come with a house full of loud clocks. But I am yours, if you will have me. Elara looked at the iron flower. She realized she didn't need him to rescue her. She had rescued herself, and that made her choice powerful. Stand up, Silas, she said, smiling. I don't want to be your housekeeper. I want to be your wife, but I keep my work. I keep my needle. I keep my voice. I wouldn't have it any other way, Silas vowed. 12 years later, 1897, Iron Ridge is no longer a fortress of silence. It is a place of vibrant life. The garden gate, finally finished, stands as a masterpiece, iron vines and flowers swirling in the wind. In the sunroom, Miss Cordelia, incredibly old, sits with a girl on her lap. 10-year-old Sarah reads from Alice in Wonderland. Elara stands on the porch. She is 38. There are silver threads in her hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She wears a dress of her own design, wool embroidered with golden leaves. She is the matriarch, the philanthropist, the artist. Silas wraps his arms around her waist. He smells of sawdust and home. The boys are asleep, he murmurs. And the gate? Elara asks. Fix the hinge, Silas says. It sings now. They look out over their kingdom, not of gold but of resilience. Clara married a banker who lost his fortune in the panic of '93. She lives a bitter life. Beatrice never married. Elara feels no triumph, only distant pity. She touches her locket. Inside, a scrap of paper in Silas's hand. The crocus blooms in winter. Do you remember, Silas asks, that night in the barn? When you told me I was looking at the wrong thing. I remember you told me I was standing in the dark. She replies. We both were, he says. The wind picks up. A chinook. It rattles the pines, but the house stands firm. I love you, Silas, she says. And I you, Elara, he replies. More than iron, more than breathe. They stand in the twilight, two survivors who found softness in each other. The shadow girl is gone. In her place stands a woman who bloomed, not because the sun shone on her, but because she learned to be her own light. And that, my friends, is the story of Elara and Silas. It reminds us that the most powerful rescues don't involve guns or horses, but a refusal to accept the life others have written for you. What did you think of Elara's journey? Type bloom in the comments if you made it to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of the Wild West. Until next time, keep your fires burning.